I want to preface this first story that I'm going to share with just something real quick on how the life of a pastor or minister is. It's an interesting one, right? And what I mean by that is even when we have a day off, we don't really have a day off, right, Ronnie? He's in the back over there. Uh, but no, what I mean by that is sometimes when we're on vacation, we'll get a text or a phone call, or when it's a holiday, someone might be trying to reach out to us. There's never really a full break, if that makes sense. So a couple Mondays ago, on Memorial Day, I was in the middle of making breakfast, and I got a phone call. That's typically how it works. I'm in the middle of making breakfast for the boys. I get this call, and typically if it's not an 850 number or a number I recognize, I just okay, I don't know who this is. They could leave a message, I'll get back to them, that kind of thing. But this, for whatever reason, this number that wasn't an 850 number, I just said, you know what, I'm going to take this phone call. I don't know who it is or what they want, but we'll see. Maybe I won $1 million. That didn't happen. But I answered the phone. I had a hard time hearing this guy. The call was super staticky. I could hardly make out what he was saying, and the phone call kept dropping. So I'm in the middle of making breakfast. The guy's calling back. Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, can you continue sharing the story? As it turned out, he needed a room, a place to stay, and he was explaining his story, which took about 20 minutes for him to explain the preface of the story and what he needed. That's typically how it happens sometimes. But here's the honest truth. When we receive phone calls like this, oftentimes we're curious if they're telling the truth. Many times in our vocation, we have people try and manipulate a story or a situation in order to gain whatever it is that they're looking for. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's gas, sometimes it's a place to stay. But sometimes, really we have to try and do our best to show and share compassion. There's always a story, and you really have to take it with a grain of salt. And sometimes you really don't know if they are telling the truth. So I'm in the middle of making breakfast on a holiday with my family, and I found myself getting a little bit irritated. Because you know what? This is my day with family. This is my protected time. And another thing as a pastor, sometimes you just don't get that break, right? So I'm with my family. And I had to have this shift in my attitude because, what if this guy was telling the truth? What if it were the 6th or 7th church that he tried contacting, and we were the only ones willing to help out in this situation? So what if the phone call keeps dropping and cutting out, etc.? What if he is fabricating this story? If putting a roof over his head for one night is what he needs, and we can offer that help he needs, what a gift. The story from our text this morning paints a sobering picture in relation to what happened to me on Memorial Day. You see, the religious institution does, from time to time, a mighty fine job of keeping things in check, making sure everyone follows the rules, regardless of how it actually affects other people. Now, me following the rules of not working on a holiday, that would have meant not answering the phone, which would have resulted in this man and his son potentially not having a place to sleep that night. And I can't know that for sure, but what I do know is that he didn't have to worry about it because I set aside my own pettiness. Now, I share all this because, I'm not perfect. Erin can attest to that, right? I'm not perfect. She's shaking her head, yeah. Or she's nodding, yeah. I have moments I'm not proud of. I get irritated when things seem to be a bit of an inconvenience. Sometimes it's hard for me in the moment to set aside whatever it is I'm doing or whatever it is I believe is more important and be present and be patient. What's striking about the reading from this morning is just how much the religious institution of Jesus' day valued their procedures and their religious and legalistic law-keeping in order to better posture themselves. They were so concerned with following the rules, they took it a step further and added their own guidelines so as to not even get close to breaking the law. And in the midst of this, they lost one of the most important elements of being human, which is caring for those around you. The very people that were supposed to lead by example built a system that failed to serve the needs of the community, to truly love their neighbor, which ironically was breaking one of the 10 commandments. It's funny how that works, right? So one of the commandments is to love your neighbor as yourself, but in the midst of not helping their neighbor, they weren't helping themselves on the Sabbath. How could one turn a blind eye to one of the most important commandments and completely disregard the well-being of another in order to uphold whatever law or command they were choosing to honor? It wasn't supposed to work like that. It doesn't make sense. Jesus said the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So where did things go wrong with the Sabbath? You see, God intended that the Sabbath day be a day of worship, of rest, and renewal. But by the time of Jesus, it had become a heavy weight and a burden, where it was nearly impossible for the average person to keep up with all the rules. So as an example, looking at the prophet Jeremiah, in his day, keeping the Sabbath had broken down to the point where it was indistinguishable from any other day of the week. You had caravans, shopkeepers, money changers, and the like that paraded through the streets of Jerusalem, taking advantage of those religiously required to make sacrifices at the temple. Sabbath day in ancient Jerusalem looked like the parking lot at Walmart on the day after Thanksgiving. Jeremiah cried out in protest, "This is what the Lord says, be careful not to carry a load on the Sabbath day or bring it through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not bring a load out of your houses or do any work on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy as I commanded your forefathers." Breaking the Sabbath, in light of the prophet's warnings and in the aftermath of Jerusalem's destruction by its enemies, became one of the more substantial sins religious authorities attempted to regulate. To stave off God's future wrath, the Pharisees and experts in the law implemented a strict code of obligations regarding the Sabbath. In fact, the Talmud, the Jewish book providing commentary on Mosaic law, prohibited 39 different categories on the Mosaic law of keeping the Sabbath activity, ranging from writing any more than 2 letters of the alphabet to tying one's shoes or putting on your sandals. Once the Academy fully expounded upon these categories, the result was a nexus of hundreds, if not thousands, of outlaw Sabbath activities. This was a far cry from the Exodus commandment or Jeremiah's warning to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. In an attempt to regulate people's work, the Pharisees turned the Sabbath day into more work than the average struggling Jewish family could possibly complete. They had completely missed the plot. Now, I hesitate in sharing this next story. When you get in front of a group of people, sometimes when you share an intimate story, you get raw and vulnerable. So I'm going to go ahead and share it. I don't know what kind of emotion it's going to elicit as I get into it, but there's a little bit of context to this behind the story. Now, many people here are familiar with the story of how Ronnie and I met, and how me coming to A Simple Faith came to be. If you're not familiar with that story, meet me after church and we'll get coffee this week. I'd love to share it with you. It's fun. But for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to get into all that. But upon meeting Ronnie and hearing about some of his writings, he pointed me to his book, Leaving Religion and Following Jesus. After that, I read another one of his books, How Far Is Heaven? And in these books, I read some incredible insights on Scripture and passages that I hadn't heard before or had been taught in the church or any other sort of setting. It was a fresh take on the life and teachings of Jesus, but what had really caught my attention is all the different moments he talked about the church, what it was, what it is, and what the church should be. It wasn't a conversation to bash the church, but to encourage the church to be a place of healing, a place of protection, and a place that brings comfort, a place of growth where a community of people from all walks of life and backgrounds can come together and learn what it means to grow in compassion, to walk in peace, and to love well. He talked about this place, a transient and oftentimes nomadic little church that started because a few people were yearning for a taste of something different. Yeah, I was hooked. I've never been a part of anything like that. And to be fair, I grew up in a very loving church with some really incredible people. And I wouldn't trade that experience for anything in the world. It gave me a great foundation for my faith that was absolutely necessary at the time. And additionally, I've had separate wonderful experiences in my ministry and in being a pastor where I've met incredible people and we've had great experiences. But the church I was a part of after meeting Ronnie wasn't checking some of the boxes. I was increasingly finding myself at odds with the way things were being done. I'm not going to get into all the details, but you could say the institution was elevated in ways that were unhealthy. And when I say institution, I'm talking about the programs, the policies, the procedures. And it wasn't like that all the time, but the story I'm about to tell it helps paint the picture a little bit better. So there's this one Monday night, I got a frantic phone call from a friend, and he and I were both just at a men's group at the church that evening. And we had been home for maybe 40 minutes or so, and he had called me and said that his son was in severe pain and complaining of his head hurting, and that he had gone unconscious. And he was explaining that an ambulance was on its way to pick him up to take him to the ER. So I immediately went to the hospital and met them in the ER room. And all I remember is that they were taking him to Riley Hospital in Indianapolis, one of the best children's hospital in the country. So I drove my friend to Indianapolis and stayed with him until the early morning hours, where it was revealed that his son had a fast-growing tumor. And they had to do surgery right away in order to save his life. I left the hospital that morning with a lot of things on my mind. First and foremost, we need to set up a prayer meeting as a church. We need to make sure their other kids were taken care of. We need to make sure they have everything they need while they're at the hospital with their son, and the church needs to find a way to help. Now, those first three were met right away. We had a massive prayer gathering that Wednesday night, and folks in the church had come together, provided pickup times for the kids. They provided a whole bunch of meals. They had brought gift cards, meals, and anything else they needed to the hospital for the husband and wife while they were with their son. Everything was taken care of for that first week. And the following week, we had an elder meeting and discussed what the church would do. And I only share the next details of what happened because the context matters. When I suggested setting aside 10% of our overall general budget to help offset any costs that might accrue from the family's extended stay at the hospital, it was met with blank faces and a few groans. Both of the parents were taking time away from work to be with their son, which meant they had no source of income. When I suggested doing a love offering, same thing. Blank stares, heads down, no response. I'll never forget what happened next. One of the gentlemen spoke and said, "I'm afraid if we do something like that, it'll set a precedent for the next time something like this happens." And I immediately responded, "Wouldn't that be a good thing?" Then another person spoke up and said, "We should wait and see what the insurance covers first." And then I don't remember much after that. Things went into blur. There's some other things that were said that I'm not going to share, but I had never been so disappointed and angry and hurt by the church. Details matter. This was a church sitting on $250,000 in funds to pay towards building debt, $50,000 in a separate missions fund, and $90,000 in the general fund account. I only mentioned 10% of the general fund, $9,000 to help a family in need, while they had nearly $400,000 in the bank. We don't want to set a precedent. Folks, that's the very disease Jesus was trying to fight. He wasn't anti-Pharisee. He wasn't against whatever rules they set up that kept them from, or he was against the rules. He was against the things that they had set up that kept them from loving and caring for people. The rules that created barriers and burdens. He was against any system, whether it be religious or the government, that aided in beating down people. He wasn't angry at them for being Pharisees. He wasn't angry at the Romans for being Romans. He was angry at what they were doing. He was saddened by the response of religious posturing and rule keeping that prevented them from being decent human beings. The precedent we need to establish as decent human beings, as followers of Jesus and as the church, is to go above and beyond when there's a need, especially if it's a great need. I'm glad I caught myself on that Memorial Day because I was so close to being the exact opposite of what Jesus desires. It took 30 minutes to show compassion, and like 5 or 6 drop phone calls, of course, and a phone call to the hotel manager, and can you repeat that one more time? I can't hear you. That's all it took. It's just a few minutes of time. I'll likely never hear from this person again. I don't know. And my prayer since that interaction is, I hope it was enough. I hope it was enough just for that one night. I hope good things come out of that interaction on his part too. I hope that he can learn to trust the church after trying to call 6 or 7 others. It took an incredible amount of humility for him to make that phone call, and took just a sliver of compassion on my part to help. Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save life or to destroy it? This is a great and healthy reminder for not just myself, but for us as the church, to always be prepared to do good, because we don't know the impact it's going to have on those who really need it.